Welcome, everyone. My name is Angie Pete Yell, and on behalf of the University of Texas College of Liberal Arts Development Office and Public Affairs teams, I'd like to welcome you to this e-talk. Thanks for taking time out of your day to hear about the impact of the college's outstanding research and teaching and the impact that it's making, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. If you have questions for Dr. Art Markman, please send them through the chat function. And then during the last half of the webinar, we'll relay participant questions to the speakers from you. It is my honor to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Art Markman. He's the Annabelle Centennial Professor of Psychology and Marketing at the University of Texas at Austin and the director of the IC² Institute. He's also the founding director of the HDO program. Dr. Markman has published more than 150 scholarly works about cognitive science, decision-making, and organizational behavior. He's the founding director of the HDO program and is the author of several books, including Smart Thinking, Smart Change, Bring Your Brain to Work, and Brain Briefs, co-written with Dr. Bob Duke, and has been featured on Dr. Phil and other programs. Beyond the UT campus, he's probably best known as the co-host of KUT's Two Guys on Your Head radio show and podcast, where he and Butler School of Music professor Bob Duke explore the human mind with a unique mix of research, humor, and everyday relevance. And now I'll turn it over to you, Art.
Thanks so much, Angie. Well, thanks to everybody for being here today. I really appreciate it. And what I want to do today is to talk to you a bit about what we're doing at the IC² Institute to think about economic development in small communities, and now to think about how we rebuild economies in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so to kind of help you to see how we got to where we are today at the Institute, I want to tell you just a little bit more about my background and a little bit more about the Institute to see how this comes together. So as Angie mentioned, I'm a cognitive psychologist. I study the way people think. And about 10 years ago, I worked very closely with Amy Ware, who is a PhD in American Studies here from UT, to help to create the Human Dimensions of Organizations program, which is a liberal arts-based program that takes the humanities, social, and behavioral sciences and uses it to teach people in business, government, nonprofits, and the military about people. We started off as an executive master's program and have about 20 students a year in that program. And since then, we've also expanded to an undergraduate major that has about 400 majors around campus. And what's critical about that for this story is that we take a very human-centered approach to thinking about the way that organizations function. And the reason that that's critical is because after spending 8 years at the Human Dimensions of Organizations program, it was really time for new leadership to come in, to bring in new ideas and to push the program forward. And at about the same time, the IC² Institute on campus was looking for a new director. And I've been affiliated with IC² for about 12 or 13 years, since John Sibley Butler was the director. The IC² Institute was founded in 1977 by George Kosmetsky, who had been dean of the business school and was also independently wealthy. He was the founder of Teledyne. And when he stepped down as dean of the business school in the 70s, he gave some significant gifts to the university, one of which was to found the IC² Institute, which at the time stood for the Institute for Constructive Capitalism. It's gone through a few name changes. We just call it IC² now. But his fundamental goal, Kosmetsky's vision for the Institute, was to create what he called a think and do tank, where we would both do basic research to understand key problems and then turn that research into programs that would actually influence the way that the world works. And he was interested in what he called wealth creation, which was the idea that we want to enhance not the wealth of a small number of people, but rather to create economic activity that lifts up entire communities. And so he was very interested in how that could happen. And in the 1970s, when the Institute was being formed in Austin, Texas, which if you think back to that era, was kind of a sleepy college town that also happened to be the seat of state government, a lot of that focus was on how you bring together the power of universities, government, and business to create technology companies and technology commercialization. And so the IC Squared Institute really developed models for how this could be done and explored a variety of different sorts of programs that would help to create that kind of economic activity. Kosmetsky himself was a personal advisor to Michael Dell. Kosmetsky, among other people, played a big role in getting the MCC consortium to Austin, which brought the semiconductor industry to town in full force. The Austin Technology Incubator, which was the first tech incubator in the city, was hosted by the IC Squared Institute, and it even created a master's program in technology commercialization. Now that focus lasted the Institute for many years, but Austin grew from being that sleepy college town to being a real tech powerhouse in the United States that was very well known for that. And so there was less need for the Institute to be a driving force in understanding technology and technology commercialization. And so when I was asked to step in as director, one of the things that we did was to really think about, if we go back to the roots of the Institute and ask this question, how do we create wealth? And where does that need to be studied, and where do programs need to be created? As I began to talk with faculty around campus, as I began to look at issues of relevance in the state of Texas, one of the things that came up over and over again is that when you get outside of the urban corridors of the state, that the economy begins to look much different. In fact, if you just go to the census data and you look at the median per capita income in counties that are either that either have a lot of households in them or not so many, you find that the less densely populated counties of the state lag behind the more densely populated counties by several $1,000s in household income each year. And so this is clearly one signal that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to really build economies outside of urban areas. And so we shifted the focus of the Institute a year and a half ago to begin to focus on what is going on outside of these urban areas. And we did this in several ways. We funded now 10 research projects by faculty from across the university. We have people studying projects in Texas, nationally and internationally. To give you a little flavor of some of the things that we're doing, we have Craig Watkins from the Moody College of Communications, who's looking at co-working spaces around the country that have been put in rural areas, and in collaboration with John Sibley Butler is actually looking at how those co-working spaces function and how they change the social networks that people have in small communities. We have Sharon Strover, who's looking at broadband access across rural areas and how that influences people's engagement with developing new businesses and entrepreneurship in general. Not only do we have projects in Texas, we have from our College of Liberal Arts, we have Jason Abravaya, who is collaborating with several other people around the university to look at economic indicators of economic activity in West Texas. We also have things going on outside of Texas and even internationally. So, for example, Raisa Fabregas from the LBJ school is looking at how information gets shared by farmers in rural Kenya and how that influences the development of that sharing of activity influences their success. So we're engaging in research around the country and around the world. We're also engaged in projects in some of these regions. And so just to introduce you to a couple of projects, one of the projects that we started last summer and expanded this summer is a new program called Home to Texas. So one of the things that we know about the University of Texas at Austin is that we bring people from all over the state of Texas to the 40 acres, and some of them never leave. And in fact, many of the students who come from outlying communities in the state often get to these more urban areas and don't really go back home to contribute to their local economy after graduation. And we wanted to give students a chance to look at those communities that they grew up in with the adult eyes that they're developing as university students, rather than the eyes of the kids that they were as high school seniors, And so what we did was to create a program in which we take first-year undergraduates and we send them back home for the summer with a paid internship. We provide the funding for the internship, but we work with communities to develop those internships. And then while the students are home for the summer, they also engage in a series of interviews to learn about their communities from civic leaders and government leaders and business leaders and faith leaders, so that when they get to the end of the summer, they understand their communities more. So we had 10 students in our first summer of Home to Texas. We have 38 students in our second year of Home to Texas. So we're very excited about that. It's actually one of the few internship programs that we actually did launch this year. So many internship programs, unfortunately, were canceled because of the pandemic, but Home to Texas did continue. We also had a student competition. So we gave away the George Kosmetsky Memorial Prize this year. We got a generous donation from some of George Kosmetsky's family, and so we were able to give this prize on the basis of a competition in which groups of students, teams of undergraduates and graduate students, studied a community for a month. They each picked a community around Texas, studied it for a month, and then we did kind of a hackathon. We gave them 36 hours. So on a Thursday evening, we gave the students an economic development challenge. We asked them whether a mixed-use development downtown in that community would be a good idea. And the students then had 36 hours to develop a proposal and a pitch for that proposal. And they worked hard on that. And then we evaluated those pitches, and they actually then we had to do this virtually because it was the end of March. So the pandemic had already begun. We actually had a team of celebrity judges. The 10 top teams gave their pitches, and we awarded prizes. We were going to award prizes to the top 3 teams, but actually there was a tie for 3rd place. So we ended up giving out 4 prizes this year. And if you go to the IC Squared website, ic2.utexas.edu, you can see the winners, and actually you can find out a little bit more about what they worked on. So that's what we did up until March of this year. But to get now to what we're working on right now at the Institute, as we began to see the pandemic leading to social distancing, closing of businesses, economic activity began to grind to a halt, we began to realize very quickly that the smaller communities were going to be hit particularly hard by the economic devastation, because there's just less resilience right now in some of the outlying areas. There are fewer businesses, so that if businesses close, there are fewer other options to pick up the slack. And so we had real concerns about what was going to happen. And of course, on top of that, if you look at the smaller communities in West Texas, which had been undergoing an oil boom, and of course, anybody who's been in Texas for any length of time, you know that boom is inevitably followed by some fall off in the oil industry. We had been doing projects out in West Texas with the hope of finding ways to create a broader base for that economy, so that when the oil prices fell, that there would be a softer cushion. But unfortunately, the pandemic led to a real crash in oil prices, which led to an immediate stoppage of a lot of the drilling that was happening out in West Texas. And so those communities, I think, were also suffering quite a bit. And so what we did was to try to prepare for the economic recovery. And the way that we've done that is by creating a regional economic recovery team. And that recovery team is engaged in a series of 3 projects that we have just launched. The first of those projects is a project that we're calling a community asset mapping project. So we hired about 70 undergraduates and a few graduate students from the university for a part-time internship over the summer. So this goes beyond the Home to Texas program that I told you about. We hired an additional 70 students. We got a couple of generous donations to help with that. Almost all of those students are working in Texas, although we did get some funds from a group in Louisiana. So we have a few students doing some things in Western Louisiana. And we are studying communities there. And so these students who just started their work in June are they are engaging in interviews with key members of the community. They are also going to be launching a survey to try to understand a variety of important factors about what is driving the economy. We're looking for challenges and opportunities. We're looking for an interest and willingness to start new businesses. We don't really know whether there's much of an appetite for starting business. A lot of small business owners saw their businesses evaporate at the front end of the pandemic. So we don't know how much appetite there's going to be for entrepreneurship. But we're looking for an understanding of the challenges and the opportunities that people in communities see. And there is as Angie said, there's an opportunity to put questions in the chat, and she actually put one in there from earlier that came in before the talk started, having to do with trying to understand ways to correct for systemic racism. One of the things that we think is really important as we begin to study communities is actually to try to get as broad a view of those communities as possible. And if you think about many of the smaller communities around the state, they are quite diverse. There's usually a variety of different racial and ethnic groups that make up that community, but not all of those individuals are necessarily going to be as prominent when you first enter a city. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is to make sure that if the city government or the city economic leaders of a community are mostly white, that we actually try to find members of other communities in order to make sure that we can, that we get as broad a view into those communities as possible. And that has included going, visiting churches, and now doing virtual visits to a variety of churches around communities and other civic groups to try to make sure that we get a really complete view of what's going on in communities around the state. And so our students right now are working on this. They're going to spend the months of June and July on this. And so we're going to get a very deep view into a variety of communities. At the end of this process, those students are actually going to write up a report that they're going to return to those communities. And we're going to have a large data set of a variety of, to understand a variety of the communities to understand what's going on in a variety of communities. And this is being done throughout the state. So we were able to identify these communities by working with a number of groups, including the Governor's Office of Economic Development and Tourism, who helped us quite a bit in identifying communities from around the state. So one of the questions that just came in, I see, is will we loop back to the communities with findings and recommendations? And so that's a great question, and that actually leads to the next program in our list. So as I mentioned, there are 3 things we're launching, and the first is this community asset mapping project. Now, at the conclusion of that, every community that participates will get a report back, both from the students as well as with some editing from us as well. But in addition to that, one of the things that we're going to be doing is having that program lead gracefully into a second program that we're calling Regional Accelerate, and cleverly calling that Accelerate, XLR8. And what Regional Accelerate is going to be is a program that is designed to help communities to think about the human-centered kinds of problems that will that may get in the way of doing good economic development. So, there are lots of organizations out there that will help communities to make use of government funds that might be out there that might help in understanding different modes of financing. What we want to focus on is where I think our real strength is, which is in understanding how people can work together and to try to align their goals in order to move things forward. And in particular, let me give you an example. In a lot of communities, one of the things that we see is that the community tends to focus on how to grow a business within the particular community. So, and it's not just growing businesses. Often what communities try to do is to attract some kind of business to come in from the outside. And of course, that can be a valuable strategy. But when a company comes in from the outside, a lot of the big money really stays outside of the community because the management structure for that organization lies outside of the community. And a lot of the small business owners in communities tend to be people who set up shops that buy and sell things to each other. So you might have somebody who owns a clothing store or a yoga studio or a massage studio or something like that. And those are important businesses to have in a community, but they don't bring any additional money to the community. And so it's really important to help communities to find ways to develop businesses that will actually bring more funds in from the outside. And many smaller communities over the last decade had tended to do that through arts communities. So they would encourage artists to come. They would have arts festivals, and they would basically create tourist destinations around both the natural scenery and the arts in the region. And that can be very powerful when the economy is good, but may suffer when there's a down economy and people don't necessarily have the disposable income to be able to go travel. And of course, now it's not just the disposable income, it's also there just isn't much travel happening. And so we're interested in what are the ways that communities could create businesses that would actually bring funds into the community. And one of the opportunities that we see here, and this is going to get to that human element in a moment, one of the opportunities that we see is that we believe that there's going to be a real appetite around the country for bringing a little bit more of the supply chain domestically. That there's a lot of companies that have been trying to source parts and other things from overseas. And this may be a good time to make sure that we also have a supply chain that includes businesses in the United States, which means that we'll need more manufacturing, but also more warehousing and logistics in order to take part in that supply chain. Now, the thing about small communities is that no individual community is likely to be sufficient by itself to be able to house all of those businesses and to have all of the necessary workers and to have whatever worker training might be required to bring everybody up to speed to participate. And so rather than thinking within the boundaries of particular communities, one of the things that we're interested in is how do we create regional collaborations? How do we get the people in the communities to think of their self, not just as ending at the border of their community, but as encompassing the region that they live in. And we've done some interesting studies over the years. We have a great collaboration with a number of communities in northern Sweden that have worked together to do things like to bring a significant rechargeable battery facility into one community, where workers for those factories will actually live in some of the neighboring communities. And in addition to that, other communities will participate in other aspects of that supply chain and the logistics associated with it. So we have some great examples of how this can be done effectively. Not only have we done work in northern Sweden, we've actually done work in northwest Arkansas. We've collaborated with the Walton Family Foundation and Walmart in the northwest Arkansas region to look at how a series of communities. So Walmart itself has its headquarters in Bentonville, but if you think about the greater region that also includes nearby communities like Fayetteville, you actually have a whole region that can collaborate together, not just to support a single large company, and in fact, Northwest Arkansas is home to 3 large companies, but also can allow a number of smaller companies to grow up around that in order to supply not just Walmart, but also companies like J.B. Hunt and Tyson that are also in the region. So our experience in those areas is giving us some ways of helping communities in Texas to think about how they might collaborate regionally in order to take part in changes in the economy that are likely on the horizon as we move forward. not only are we interested in, and so the Regional Accelerate program is really going to take the results of this community asset mapping, and also we're also taking the instruments that we're using, the interview questions and the surveys, and making those available to communities that were not studying with students over the summer. We were able to launch many students out there this year, but there were more communities than there are students. And so we are giving communities all of our materials so that they can study themselves. But then everyone is eligible to participate in Regional Accelerate, where we want to get people together and really talk to them through a series of webinars and videos and mentoring. And we're putting together a mentoring network. We'd like to see if we can help those communities to collaborate with each other. I see a question here about worker education. And so, it's one of the things that we're also trying to do is to work with education institutions in those regions. We have a great collaboration that we've fired up with the UT campus in Permian Basin. Sandy Woodley, their relatively new president, has worked with us, and we're going to be helping them by, they have a community economic development building that sits in between Odessa and Midland, and we're going to be helping them to launch some facilities there to do worker training. And we are trying to partner up with a variety of other education institutions, both four-year institutions, but also community colleges around the state, to provide additional worker training and to help communities to think about where the next generation of training might come from. We're also collaborating with folks in the Texas Rural Funders Collaborative, because they are working with, they help to fund a new organization called Connected Texas, which is an offshoot of a larger organization called Connected Nation that looks at broadband access in rural communities, because of course rural communities have generally speaking, have less strong broadband access than urban communities do, and that poses a problem for businesses and for individuals. We've talked a lot about the lack of hospitals and lower levels of healthcare in some of our rural communities, and the solution to that is often thought to be telemedicine, but it's hard to telemedicine without the telepiece. And so we have to make sure that there's better broadband access. And so I think that's going to be an important piece of this. And as I mentioned earlier, Sharon Strover from our College of Communications is working with IC² on some funded projects, really trying to look at ways that we might enhance the broadband infrastructure in order to create more business development and to develop more new businesses. So the second leg of our set of programs is this Regional Accelerate program, which we'll be launching in the fall to do this kind of training for communities. And we are engaging with economic development people around the state in order to make that happen. And then the third program that we'll be launching after that is, I mentioned earlier, the George Kosmetsky Prize that we gave out, where we use this kind of methodology to get a group of people together to form teams and really think deeply and intensely about a problem in a short period of time. And that sort of methodology can also be valuable in solving difficult economic development challenges throughout the state. And so using a variety of people, including students at UT, but also, and other institutions, but also experts from around the state, we hope to launch some economic development challenges to solve particularly difficult regional problems that arise as we go through the process of asset mapping and Regional Accelerate. And so that's going to be the third leg of what we're working on. And we're working on doing some fundraising there as well, because we'd like, when we do those kinds of problem-solving exercises, to actually be able to provide some funds for the best ideas to help to get those off the ground. And so that's sort of the third leg of the stool here. And so before I look at some of the questions that have come in, let me just give you some sense of what where we're going in the future, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. So basically, at the Institute, we're continuing to to work on new research projects. We're funding a new project now on rural media, because that's another big issue. It turns out it's often easier for people in smaller communities to find out what's going on nationally than it is to find out what's going on locally, because there are fewer and fewer local media outlets. And so we've been looking at, we have folks from, again, from the Moody College of Communications, looking at rural media and how we might enhance local newspapers and other journalism. We're also interested in trying to make connections between things that are happening in the United States and other places. We have a project that we're going to be beginning in Ecuador, looking at regional collaboration there, because there are some interesting projects happening there that may actually have some implications for what happens here in Texas. And as I mentioned, we are forging ahead with a collaboration with the folks at UT Permian Basin. And we're looking forward to, right now we have actually some students in our community asset mapping project who are UT Permian Basin students. And that's our first collaboration. We're going to be helping them with their community economic development building, and really trying to create more of a system-wide approach to thinking about how to help the communities across the state of Texas. And so those are some of the things that are on the horizon as we begin to move forward.
We have some great questions. So one seems pretty easy. Is there a list of the communities that you're working with somewhere? And if so, where can we find it?
Yeah, so the IC Squared website is ic2.utexas.edu. We can put that in the chat, I guess. And if you go to our programs page on the IC Squared website, it lists a variety of the different programs we're working on, including the Rural Economic Recovery Team, which has a really nice map that we just made that actually pinpoints all of the communities that we're working in. And so you can see the spread of those communities around the state. And we've really done I think a good job of catching the entire state on this. So we really are looking all over the place. And so I'm actually really excited to see how the results come in. Over the last year and a half, we've had an opportunity to go out to West Texas. We've had an opportunity to go down to the border to McAllen. We've had an opportunity to go to East Texas. So the background you see behind me here is actually from a brew pub in Lufkin, Texas. We had an opportunity to meet with some developers who are redeveloping the downtown area in Lufkin, using a very novel approach in which, instead of going to banks for financing, they put together a consortium of individuals who lent them money to buy buildings, renovate them, and then once the buildings had been renovated, they could get traditional mortgages and then repay the investors, who would then put together another consortium to buy another building. And they've been slowly going through the downtown. And not only have they renovated buildings, they've built apartment complexes in the upper floors of those buildings, and in the lower floors they've got this is a brew pub that they put in. Across the street there's a coffee shop, there's a few retail outlets, and they're building a hotel, there's a pretty decent restaurant there. So they've really managed to revitalize the downtown area. Although, as you can see, a lot of those are businesses that are basically serving the community. So they're buying and selling things to each other. And so, again, one of the big issues with many communities, including Lufkin, is how do you get outside money to come in? East Texas had a lot of paper and timber industry, and that's still a part of the economy there. There is some manufacturing as well, but they're looking to broaden the base of things there. Long answer to a short question.
Great, thank you. The cost of living is lower in rural communities. Have you studied whether household income comparisons represent a fair indicator of relative wealth and/or disposable income?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's true that in some ways you can get away with a little bit less. I think what we see in many of these communities is that the household income is a little misleading, because we do have I think we see levels of income inequality in some of the smaller areas that are similar to what we see in some of the urban areas. And so there are, if you go to these communities, you will find some beautiful areas of town, and you will find some areas that are not doing particularly well. So if we think about the type of wealth creation that George Kosmetsky talked about, that was really intended to lift entire communities, I think we're seeing a little bit less of that. And so I think, the other thing is a lot of communities have really gone after trying to bring in, say, a manufacturing plant that might bring in 40 or 50 jobs. Those jobs are largely low-skill, low-wage jobs, and they don't create a lot of middle-class income. There's a shop foreman and maybe one manager, but most of the executive leadership of those companies resides somewhere else. And I think it's the middle class that is really what stabilizes communities. It's the people who give donations to local events, who sponsor the league teams, who are civically minded because they're part of the community. And that's one of the things that we see is missing in a lot of these communities that we hope to see get built up.
We have an attendee who spent some time living in Marfa, and she's asking about how tourism drives up the cost of living in those types of places, such that the locals end up not being able to afford property taxes on the homes they inherited from their parents. So are you concerned about exacerbating income inequality between the local, often Latinx populations and the white populations who immigrated there from cities?
Yeah. So our hope is, if we look at Marfa, for example, it's a fascinating community. A lot of the development in Marfa has come from the outside. Chinati itself comes from outside investment they basically found the area appealing and built, an art installation, and a lot of the other arts community is really involves people who came from outside the community. A lot of what we're focused on is how do we build from the inside? How do we get people inside of communities to think about how to, with mentoring, with a lot of because there isn't always a lot of business expertise in these communities, but how do we help people to build businesses, to grow them from the inside? How do we help communities to find those businesses that currently employ 4 to 6 people, which is really too small to be very resilient? But some of those businesses should only employ 4 to 6 people, but some of them could actually, with a little bit of advice and maybe an infusion of capital, grow to employ 15 to 20 or maybe even more. Those homegrown businesses can be powerful ways of lifting up entire communities. And so, we believe that the best way to combat the income inequality is not to bring in businesses from the outside, but rather to grow them from the inside, and to grow them from the population that lives in that community, and to encourage broad participation in that from the inside. So I think you're absolutely right. When too much investment comes in from the outside, then the town can change its character in ways that can actually make it less attractive and less affordable for the people who were already living there.
Thank you. Another questioner says that in her experience, politics and local leaders dominate rural economic development. So how do you bypass this or work within this deeply embedded structure?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing if you look in local communities. For one thing, a lot of local communities don't have an entrenched bureaucracy. And a lot of times we think, well, bureaucracy, it's good that you don't have an entrenched bureaucracy. But actually, a lot of the people who are true bureaucrats, and if you go back into the history of the word bureaucracy, Max Weber thought this was a good thing. These were the government structures that would outlast the politicians. And the people who are true bureaucrats, that is the ones who really understand the way government works, they're the ones who can help communities to navigate all of the complexities of trying to grow a community. And I think one of the problems that small towns have is they don't have a bureaucracy. People who are involved in city government or municipal government from a small community standpoint are often looking to move up the food chain elsewhere in communities. And so you're left with just the people who end up being involved in local politics. What we think is really important there is to provide more mentorship to the community itself. That is, not just to go in and talk to the people who identify as community leaders, but really to try to find out what individuals are around who are interested, excited to create businesses, and to then try to work with them and to use other institutions. It could be community colleges and communities that have one. It could be the library. It could be the local high school. But to use those institutions as ways to provide a broader access to the kinds of resources from businesses. And I think that I think there's a real appetite for that now. I think we are beginning to realize the dangers of having a lack of resilience in our economy, and so I think that communities are really looking now for how can we build a variety of businesses.
Okay. Do the students assess access to healthcare in their access mapping? And are there any plans to do a project that emphasizes or researches literacy and education in rural areas?
Yeah. So when we look at challenges and opportunities in those communities, we are certainly trying to find out. We have access to some maps that look at the presence of local hospitals. So we do know how far it is to the nearest hospital. We're also trying to find out what healthcare elements exist in communities, some of which might be clinics, but some of them might be also telehealth, and to what degree is that something that is viable. So it is an important element, and it's an important element in part because if you're going to try to get people to grow businesses, and if you're, and if you need some short-term mentorship, you may need some people with business expertise to actually locate themselves in a community for a little while. It is hard to get people to move to a community when the nearest hospital is 75 miles away. We were talking about this one day at the IC² Institute, which if you're not in Austin, think about the campus. The IC² Institute, because George Kosmetsky had been dean of the business school, he didn't want the institute to be owned by any particular college. So it's actually a college-wide resource, and to make it so, he actually bought land about 6 blocks west of campus. So we're at 29th and San Gabriel, and he bought the land there, built the building, and then gave it to the university. So I encourage you to come and take a look at the building sometime when you're in town. And there's free parking, so you can pull up and wave at us. But we were talking about the issue of healthcare, standing in the parking lot one day and realizing that if you stand in the parking lot at the IC² Institute, within 2 miles, there are 3 different hospitals. We have the hospital around the medical school, we have St. David's by I-35, and then we have Seton. And so we have this embarrassment of riches in healthcare in Central Texas. And that is not the case in a lot of other communities. And it's something that I think is an important part of what we need to understand in order to build those economies. So we're very interested in that. And the other thing that we're interested in is how do we help communities to work with other learning institutions. Again, it could be 4-year colleges. There are a number of 4-year, if you think in West Texas, for example, about colleges like Sul Ross, or if you think about the variety of community colleges. Those are all places that can really help out a lot with workforce development. And in communities that don't have either a community college or a 4-year college, there still is the local school system. And many of those local school systems are interested in continuing education. And we'd like to find ways to help with that, and also to connect them up to resources that we have here at UT, including mentoring networks. And we're trying to build up a variety of videos and other things here that folks who are interested in economic development might find useful.
Great. We're getting a lot of great questions here. I hope we can get to all of them. The next one is, what do you think the likelihood of real nationwide 5G, which would enable better jobs in smaller communities?
So, you know, one of the interesting things about the United States is that we have structured our infrastructure in a way that it tends to lag the market, meaning that a company needs to know that they'll be profitable in doing something before they invest in the infrastructure. And so broadband gets to a place when there's enough individuals already there who are going to use it to create that infrastructure. And the same thing is true with healthcare. You get significant healthcare installations after you have a whole bunch of people who can afford the healthcare. And I raise this because one of the interesting things about the contrast between Texas and northern Sweden, when I mentioned that we've done this work with northern Sweden, they've been very successful at doing economic development there. Not only did they get the Northvolt battery installation, they actually have some of the largest server farms for some of the big computing companies like Facebook out there, because Sweden has two big things going for it, well, three big things going for it. The first is it's cold, and server farms need to be kept cold. Second is that it's isolated, and that means that there's a lot of space. But the third thing, and this is the thing that's a little bit less obvious, Sweden actually decided that broadband is a right of its citizens, not something that lags the market. And so they built a broadband infrastructure for the country first. And so when these communities in northern Sweden were looking to take advantage of some of their natural resources, like the cold, they didn't have to then say, oh, and we'll spend the next 3 years building the internet infrastructure that's required to make a server farm viable. They already had that internet backbone there. And so one of the things that this suggests is we really need to think from a policy standpoint about the role that we want things like broadband to play in our communities, and to ask the question, can we invest more in our more of our public dollars in the creation of that infrastructure? So, you know, this is a long way of getting at the question, but the answer to the question, will we have something like nationwide 5G, depends a little bit on whether there is an appetite for investment in areas where it isn't necessarily going to be profitable on day one, but where the presence of that kind of infrastructure would facilitate the development of other kinds of businesses later. And so it truly is an investment, because it's saying if we build this first, we will create more opportunities for people to do things that wouldn't be possible without it.
Thank you. Will you be looping back to the communities with your findings and recommendations? And will you advise some communities to launch businesses? And if so, will they have guidance?
Yeah, so again, I think a big part of the Regional Accelerate program is how do we then take the initial asset mapping that we developed from the students, use that data to help communities to see what opportunities they have in front of them, and then to guide them on those opportunities. And so, for example, I mentioned early on the Austin Technology Incubator, which is with the first technology incubator in the city. It is no longer officially a part of the IC Squared Institute, though it does reside on the third floor of the IC Squared building. And they have a wonderful network of business mentors. And we are working with Mitch Jacobson, their director, to try to develop a set of mentors that might be able to help with smaller communities around the state, because we are going to encourage communities to promote the development of businesses that might take part in this, in bringing the supply chain domestically, but they're going to need advice on how to do that. And some of that advice is going to be how to finance that. Some of that advice is going to be, how do I run the business? How do I grow the business successfully? How do I connect to other companies? And that's where I think a lot of the expertise that comes out of the more urban areas can be really valuable.
Are local labor pools generally older, or are you able to reverse the flight of the young from small towns?
Yeah, you know, there's certainly a lot of younger people are escaping from smaller communities. And one of the reasons that we launched the Home to Texas program is to get some of our students to really think about ways that they might contribute to the local economy. While there is a tendency for those communities to skew a little bit older, there still are younger people in those towns. The problem for many of them is that they don't necessarily see a future. They don't necessarily see what their jobs are going to be down the line. And so one of the reasons that there's been a pretty continual movement from the rural areas to the urban areas is that that's where people see opportunity. But I think that there are two important things right now. The first is I do think that there are a lot of opportunities for business growth in rural areas. I also think that there's a little bit more interest in rural regions right now for two reasons. One, not everybody is as excited about density as they were a year ago. We've begun to see some of the limitations of having people live in very close proximity to each other. But the other is, of the questions have asked about issues related to cost of living. And I've been in Austin, Texas for 22 years now. I was lucky enough to get here at a time when I could buy my first house in Austin on a cul-de-sac. It was a small house on a cul-de-sac that I was able to get for under $200,000. I don't know what that house would sell for today, but I'm virtually certain it's more than that. Austin is no longer an inexpensive place to live. And, I think that a lot of people who have that dream of owning their own home and having a yard and all of those, those things that many people aspire to are looking to smaller communities as a way to make that happen. It's become more attractive for that. And I think that interest is one that we can capitalize on as we begin to rethink what the economy looks like.
In terms of capital availability, are established corporate investments more likely than venture capital startups?
Yeah, so that's a good question. As we begin to think about financing in local communities, venture capital is not, to our mind, is not the answer for a lot of small communities. And in part because venture capital and its close cousin, the angel investor, are people who generally want significant returns on their investments. And the only way to get those kinds of significant returns is for the company to either generate a stock offering or to sell. And neither of those are actually particularly good for small communities. When you have a company that grows up in a small community and it sells, there's a high probability that the people who bought it are going to move that company elsewhere to be closer to place. And a lot of times when somebody sells a business from a small community, they even if they have the opportunity to stay, they may choose to go. So it's focusing on what you could think of as the big score model of capitalism is not a great win for smaller communities. But instead, it's slower growth through more traditional kinds of loans. And this actually creates a bit of a difficulty as well. It is often hard for small companies and small communities to qualify for traditional bank loans, given the regulations around banking. There are community banks that are trying to do this, but one of the things that we've been advocating is these more creative approaches. So I mentioned what's going on in Lufkin with small groups of people, consortia of investors getting together and buying buildings, renovating them. And so they're making a return on investment, but it's a small return on each deal that compounds over time. And I think that models like that are ones that might be able to work very effectively in smaller communities. And in addition to that, trying to work with government to build up small business development funds that can provide loans that come along with mentorship. Because the other thing about a business loan is you don't just want to give somebody money, you want to give them money and advice so that the money is spent well and ultimately leads to growth. And so from a financing standpoint, those those are some of the I think the really important things that small communities need to do.
Great. We'll make this the last question and then wrap up. We had a lot of great questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but let's end with, how can we get involved and help?
Yeah. Well, I think there's lots of ways to get involved. So, so for one thing, please check out what we're doing at the IC Squared website. And if there's a particular program that we're working on that you're interested in, just reach out to me. We can, my email is easy. One of the joys of being at UT for a long time is that you can reach me at markman@utexas.edu. So I'm easy to find. Feel free to reach out and reach out and talk to me about the programs that you're interested in. We'd love to get engagement with new communities. We're interested in trying to connect with people who may have expertise that could help some of these companies in these communities in the long run. And of course, if you happen to know people who are interested in supporting the work that we're doing, I mentioned that several of the programs that we worked on are ones that have benefited from some donations from our community, and we've been able to employ a number of our undergraduates and graduate students, and this is really a place where UT gets to be the University of Texas and not just the University of Central Texas. I think we're doing quite a bit to help the entire state, and so there's lots of opportunities there as well. But I welcome the opportunity to talk more with all of you, because as you can tell, I'm very excited about the work that we do at IC Squared. It's really it's funny. You might not expect somebody coming out of the College of Liberal Arts to be working on things like this, but at their heart, these problems are human-centered problems, and that's what we know. We know, if you think about what we know in a College of Liberal Arts, we know people, and that's where the solutions to hard problems are going to come.